Okay, so this is my reading and commentary reflection on the book of Proverbs. I'm currently in chapter 25. I'm on verse 6. It's hard to know exactly how to begin these. Usually, it takes time to work my way up into something that is what I might say is a flow state, that it is something that's purposeful and meaningful. Some days, much like days that I exercise, there is this initial hesitation before I get up to that place for which I am functioning. The engines are firing in all cylinders. There's a period of adjustment, and that initial warm-up can often be quite taxing, difficult to get into gear. And I always think that it helps just to share something. It doesn't have to be anything in particular, but perhaps a thought that had occurred to me on the current day. When I was younger, I was a particularly sensitive kid. I don't think that's changed much into adulthood, to be honest. But what I remember quite vividly were these periods of emotions. I would go through these, I'm not sure what I would call them, but periods in which they would have a clear distinction of a particular theme. Perhaps it's a season, perhaps it's an event that is the centerpiece of my attention during a particular period, and my emotions sort of wrap around that and reflect that. And I look back on them like episodes in my life. And what I remember is the feelings. The feelings are that conduit into the memory. And I often wonder, especially as I'm experiencing life in the moment, at present, how I would look back and remember my awareness of my future self. That is, when I'm going through a feeling that is particularly strange, interesting, it could be negative, it could be also positive, whatever it is, but enough to prompt my mind to consider it and to think about how, in the future, I would look back on it. Now, especially in youth, but even more so into my late 20s, I began to think more and more about my memory, and if it was something that was truly felt during the period that I had felt it, or if it was sort of a gross exaggeration. Moreover, as I reflect on it now, I have to wonder that since these periods, it's not one day, perhaps it's not a week, it could be months at a time, and it's distilled down, it is compressed into this quite powerful feeling. And I would have to imagine that given one particular moment, maybe the feeling wouldn't be all that monumentous. But in aggregate, it would be. And it is committed to memory in that way. In a like manner, I think about this experience. I think about what I'm engaged in when I'm reflecting or when I'm praying. And I think that what I try to do, I think both in terms of exercise, but also in terms of the reflections on the Proverbs, or whatever it is that I happen to be doing, assuming that it is this practice-based experience, is to enter into the type of experience that would allow me to feel those intense emotions that I may have otherwise compressed in my youth down to that singular point, but is representative of some broader period. And that's not to say that I haven't had specific experiences that were quite elevatory, that I felt elated. There are surely plenty of these as well. Now the further question, I suppose, is, since I've been discussing the heart and its relationship to man's experience, how exactly ought I to relate myself to it? How ought I to use it? There are times of late where my heart has been active, telling me something that I should do, telling me that I am not doing this enough or experiencing it well enough, that there needs to be something done to open up that portal, such that my mind, much like my body in exercise, but mind and body are quite connected, especially during intense exercise. The two are inseparable. But again, of late, my heart is yearning for, it is longing for, the ability to go into a reflection at any given moment, at any given experience, and to be attentive and to be awake, to be alert, to have the engines on and the cylinders firing. Now, we all go through this to a degree. I'm not saying that I'm just coming to the realization that I actually have to pay attention to things. This is not the case. It is rather the degree of attention and the depth of experience that is actually there. And as I consider this, I consider the levels of experience. I consider the behavior that I had gone through today. I'm always very desirous of getting back to the Proverbs. And yet there's a part of me that thinks that this type of reflection, the reflective mind and the reflective state, cannot be something that is maintained for extended periods. It is not something that can just be on all of the time. And I think one can really do some harm to oneself, wishing and longing for this attentiveness, and yet failing time and time again. Now, I say that not necessarily to say that this is truly my experience, but there's an element of it that is a part of my experience. And there is a true longing for a better type of being, a better type of existence and experience. And so with this in mind, I would like to approach verse 6 of chapter 25. Put not forth yourself in the presence of the king, and stand not in the place of great men. For better it is that it be said unto you, Come up here, than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen. An interesting verse, somewhat cryptic. This happens to be two verses, verse 6 and verse 7. So let's start with verse 6. Put not forth yourself in the presence of the king, and stand not in the place of great men. Now that alone seems a bit servile. It seems to imply that the reader, or the author of this, is indicating to the reader that you do not deserve to be in the presence of the king. and that you yourself are not a great man, so you should not stand in that place. Of course, that is the cynical interpretation. Now, we know what comes after, so we can't necessarily limit ourselves to this. But I think what we should do, what we should be prompted to consider, what we are prompted to consider, is much like the last few verses that I've covered in part 1, is to go back over position, authority, not necessarily power, but power is an element, but more so position and authority, because we are explicitly prompted to consider these things in this verse. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is that what we are after here is the meaningful domain. It is the realm of mind for which we are part of the agentic class. We have a unique capacity to swim through this space, to see into it, to design, to create, to destroy, to be influenced by. I think it should also be recognized that I live, in a culture that is quite material in nature. That of my mind and of the minds of many, the first place that we go is material causes. And when I read the line, "Put not forth yourself in the presence of the king," I think of a situation where I myself, or some fictional character in the play that's running in my mind, physically appears before the king. And that's all that there is. There is just this sort of waiting room of something to happen, perhaps a dialogue or an event, whatever. But the longing of my heart kicks in, and it says to me, there's more than just that. Even though this is just an introductory part of this verse, you can think about this more deeply. You can experience this more deeply. Now, this is exactly what I'm after. And when I think about it, put not forth yourself in the presence of the king. Putting forth yourself can be physical. We can cause ourselves physically to be put forth. But also within the domain of mind, we can be put forth. And within that arena, we find the meaningful interpretation, the purposeful interpretations. And so I think this is where we should be when we consider what it means to put ourselves forth in the presence of somebody. We have to imagine that there is this landscape. For whatever reason, my mind is so partial towards an open field. I happened to have gone on a camping trip last summer, and there is this beautiful open field, and there's a house on top of the hill. There was a break in the tree line. It was such a scenic thing, and I reflected on it, and it has stayed with me. It's one of those experiences that I had mentioned earlier about the intensity of the feelings that I had in that moment, and now it's committed to memory. And so now when my mind thinks about a landscape, that's where I go. Perhaps the landscape is not particularly fit for every example, but it is a starting place. And within this plain, with the undulating hills on this prairie in the Midwest of the United States, I find myself thinking about mind. I fancy myself and others, again, it could be characters in this play, but they are floating upon this landscape within this ethereal realm. Interesting that my mind wishes to give a material form to something that is immaterial, but I am a material creature after all. But it serves as a liminal space for which I can imagine the spirits talking to one another. And that although a person may be in the presence of an executive, or of a legislature, or of some person of importance that has a fair bit of authority, we can imagine ourselves in this landscape. It's a more personal landscape. Vulnerable, I think, to a degree. Vulnerable in the sense that what is seen in that landscape is a bit more difficult to the modern man to understand, since he is such a materialist. The emotions, the subtleties, the realities of that domain, I think, go unnoticed or unattended to. So then what exactly would it mean for the form of myself within this domain of mind to be put in the presence of the other mind that is the king, that occupies a particular place for which my mind does not occupy? This question of identity is fundamental. And since within this domain we are not identifying physical objects, we are not identifying bodies or facial features, smells, or the sound of a person's voice, it is just purely a man's thoughts and his being, his essence, his existence. Now I'm after two primary things here, I think. One is what it necessarily means for the spirits to contact one another. And then the second is, in this particular situation, what does it mean for a spirit of lower authority to contact a spirit of higher authority? So of the first, we're talking about identity. Now let it be known that I had desired to introduce a concept that I had introduced on the last episode that had to do with density. And I think there is something to it, but I think I would have to consider it more. My mind was interested in drawing some parallel between the type of precision and the relationship that one can draw from taking the mass of an object and the volume of an object and relate that to its identity formation. Now, in terms of identity formation, density is, I think, a fundamental component of a particular object's composition. It can be compared to other objects. But here my mind fails to grasp the absolute parallel, which had helped me in the verse prior. So I don't think that I'll be able to use that analogy again for this explanation. But with regard to considering the spirits and how they contact one another, I find this a particularly interesting thought experiment. Now, in order to understand how they come into contact with one another, I think we have to understand what the spirit is. Now, so far I have been using this word spirit rather loosely. And by it, what I have meant was that it is the representation of mindedness that is independent of material. We could say that it has material causes to a certain degree, but there is a limit at some point between that. There's a maybe a conceptual limit or a practical limit, maybe I should say, for our purposes, exploring the depths of that relatedness between the material causes and the spiritual. These don't interest me all that much. What interests me is the spiritual causality, that formal causality. So let me try to be a little bit more precise about what I mean about this word spirit. Now, I've described the spirit many times in my explorations. I think it differs to a slight degree every time I describe it or try to define it. But I've used the illustration before of a fire, a campfire. To us, as the fire burns, we can perceive it. We can know it burns and yet not see it through some other senses. But as I consider the way in which I have described this, again, being this substance that can be appreciated in greater detail the closer one is to it. They can appreciate the sight of the experience. They can appreciate the sound of the experience. They can appreciate the smell of the experience. And they can appreciate the tactile input of the experience, given the temperature that the fire produces. We can also imagine a situation in which many of these perceptual cues are taken away, one at a time, until what we are left with is just the smell of the fire. Many of us in the Midwest understand that in the fall, many people decide to burn their leaves, and the air is full of this sweet smell. Sweet, I guess, is an arbitrary distinction. Sweet in the sense that it reminds me of fall. But I know that there is a fire somewhere, even though that I cannot see it, I cannot feel it. But this situation, this type of explanation of the spirit and the way in which we interact with it, does not satisfy, because all it does is to say that man has the capacity to perceive the spiritual realm, but it is much like his passing of a fire that is beyond his sight, beyond his tactile cues, and beyond his hearing. All that he can perceive of it is through the olfactory senses. And the spirit should not, I think, be a thing that is defined by its reduction, or by our limited understanding, or rather perception of it. And so although I think that my distinction of the spirit went beyond this at times, there was at times this thought experiment, the workout, the mental workout of understanding my relatedness to the spirit and perhaps how I can interact with it. And this crept in, I think, to too much of my definition. And so all of that is to say that I wish not to do that at this point. So, with that in mind, I don't want to discount it because I do think it's important, and I do think that the spirit, especially to those who are not necessarily trained or interested in the spiritual domain, they may perceive it only in a limited manner, in a limited sense. What I'm concerned with now is exactly what the nature of this thing is, despite the limited perception of it. Now, I had alluded to it a moment ago, that the spirit is an aspect of mind. Now, I may say that, well, is the spirit any aspect of mind, or is it just a particular aspect of mind? And here, there is a risk. There is a risk of my own personal subjectivity, that what I will define here, moving forward, may not be some institutionally accepted definition of the word spirit, for which I am certainly open to accepting. But in my ignorance I may fail to rise to a height or to accept that standard. And so I do this not necessarily out of arrogance, but rather out of the desire to move forward and to use the Proverbs in a productive manner. Now, it can be said that the words spirit and the words soul are used interchangeably. Now, I haven't used the word spirit, nor have I used the word soul as a synonym. I may have conflated the two, perhaps, but generally speaking, my definition of the spirit will include that it is an aspect of mind, but it is something entirely distinct from the body. Although we can speak of its material causes, at a certain point it doesn't matter. The existence of it is concerned not with its material cause, but rather the nature of its being. And I suppose one can get caught in the loop of having the material cause being, directly related to its being. But I mean more so in terms of the agent being aware that it occupies some space, but also is aware that there are other agents that occupy this space, this arena. And this arena is entirely independent of material causes, despite running on material software. That we are coded into this reality. But the software that we run on is not the whole of the thing, I would say. This is my belief. Now, if this is to be the case, then if there is a truly intelligent agent that has a will of its own, then it must possess the ability to connect and to realize the fact that it is not entirely limited to the material substructure, that it has the perceptive capacity to go beyond it. And it's not necessarily in the spirit of liberation that I mean this. And it is not in the spirit of a transhumanist metaphysics that I say this. But it's a matter of the way in which we are, the way in which we are programmed, that I say this. Now, that being said, because this is the case, and because man can see the fire, which we can consider like the divine light or whatever, this mechanism that has given rise, or that has tripped our perception, our alarm of perception, such that we can perceive it. Exactly what the fire is quite an interesting thing. The fire reminds us of something. It is something that is within us. It is an image that we have seen before. It is a feeling that we have felt before. It is a thought that we have thought before. The spirit is much like a conduit between the realm outside of that which we
seem to be limited to, and that which is, the moreness that is beyond the primary base reality. So today is a new day, and thank God it's a new day, so I could disrupt that previous thought. I'm not entirely sure that I want to continue with that line of thinking. There are certain elements of it perhaps that I find useful, but there's a certain expression or phrase that was coming up into my head, a rather explicit phrase that I will not utter on this podcast. But nonetheless, I think that my thinking about the spirit and about the spiritual was getting a little bit too mystical, and I would like to return to some grounded sense. Now, I may not be able to do it, and we're talking about the spirit. Now, when I say grounded, what does that mean exactly? Does it mean material? Does it mean rational, reasonable? It's kind of hard to say, but either way, I would like to return to some principle and start over again. Without going over too much ground again, I want to remind myself exactly where I am. So, the verse that we are talking about is verse 6. Put not forth yourself in the presence of the king, and stand not in the place of great men. Now, it would almost seem like, why then are we talking about the spirits? Well, again, we are talking about the spirits because we have put ourselves forth, or at least it is possible that in this hypothetical, we are imagining a situation in which we have put ourselves forth in the presence of a king. Now, in terms of putting ourselves forth, we can do that physically, we can do that formally, or spiritually, and the formal and the spiritual domain is that meaningful domain. It's, I think, what we will get the most out of if we are going to be reflecting on this. There's going to be a relationship with the physical appearance in front of the king, obviously, but in order to understand why that's significant, we have to understand what's going on in the spiritual realm. Now, of the spirit, I think one thing that I can say for sure is we're talking about something that is immaterial, that is without material, that it can be thought of independent of material causes. It's not necessary to think about material causes to consider the spiritual. The spirit has often been referred to as immaterial and immortal. Now, this immortal sense, if it is to be living forever, that it is to continue after the body of man dies, then despite the material substrate that runs the program of his existence, there is a layer of intelligibility in which the memory or the information continues, and that it is not necessarily dependent on the emergent quality that brought it to be. There's all sorts of questions there that I have personally. But if we take, even if there is some way in which this is not the case, but perhaps the way in which the formal realm is integrated into reality, whatever that means, is somewhat different than that, I think it's still worthwhile to consider what it means for man's experience to be placed within this intelligible realm. Now, the thing that it's nagging on my mind is the variability, the problem of variability. The level at which we interface at, we can call some average into question. We can look above and we can look below that average in terms of human experience, human capacity. We can look very low, in which we would find beings that perhaps are born deformed or born with a mind such that they cannot really perceive a sense of self. And these are strange dilemmas in my mind, because if we are to be considering a meta problem above the physical, I suppose we can answer that question in the sense that, well, if the self didn't really exist, then it's not really something that made the cut in terms of the level of the intelligible sphere that the human spirit would inhabit. We can imagine that there are beings that have physical form that are well beyond the human being in terms of intelligence, that they think and perhaps they interact with their environment in different ways than man can, and it would probably be just as alien as to go to the extreme of beings that are just purely agentic without form, or spirit and without form, essence. Another foundational thing here that I think is related to what I'm saying is that if this spirit is to be connected with this realm, and even though that I have my questions and my difficulties understanding how the various levels relate to one another, because man's experience is just one level, and again, of the difficulty that is brought into question about even within man's experience, the different levels of man's experience, the question is there a threshold of the interface in which the heavenly environment is permeated by the human spirit? I suppose the answer to that is, who knows, perhaps. I think it might be easier to consider it based on a continuum, and that the threshold may be drawn and may be known at some level or some situation, but it really only matters to the observer that is looking at it. For example, the human being, as the human being imagines the heavenly domain, or imagines heaven in general, in which the good aspects of the spiritual dimension have congregated together under the umbrella of that divine logos, the creative principle for all intelligibility. The tree, perhaps, or the network or the web that is created as a result of that may be something that is quite dynamic. But here again, I'm beginning to lose the principles, because it's hard for me to see one step to another without seeing a very large leap in logic and reasoning. And that I do not wish to fall into wishful thinking. I think we can get to a place, but I have to be careful. So, although these thoughts are interesting to me to have and to reflect on, and perhaps I think they may be important to a certain degree to consider the possibility of man's experience, and of course to consider the possibility that man's experience may only be relegated to the material domain, and it is the collective experience of man that is actually the thing that remains immortal, as long as he is in contact with his material substrate, as long as his kind exists. Now that would seem like an atheistic view, but it's difficult to say, really. Who's to say what the mind of the divine logos remembers and doesn't remember? But I suppose all the same that we do consider that the divine logos is omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing, all-seeing. Because this thing is the creator of sight. It is the seer of all seeing. There are plenty of places to go within this mental domain. Even to blindness, there is that possibility. But I say all of this in the spirit of curiosity. So to return to these spirits and how they are interacting. So I had put forth some principles about the spirits, that they are immortal, that they are immaterial. So, all well and good to say this about the spirits. Of the immaterial, I think we may get a good road, a good inlet to another path. Since the spirit is immaterial, even though it may have some association to a material substrate, it can act independent of the material substructure. Now, one may say, no, this is not possible. It is restricted by natural law. And I suppose to a degree that is true. But the mind is an interesting thing. Natural law doesn't imagine itself going beyond natural law, only the mind does. Not just because the mind is able to do it doesn't mean that it is beyond natural law. And also just because the mind is aware of natural law at a certain level, it doesn't mean that there are not other ways of organization such that the mind and the individual's experience can be much expanded because of it. Now, all of this is conjecture, of course. But of this thought of being immaterial, of the beings that articulate with one another that are not necessarily concerned about material causality in their interactions, although their spirits may be tethered to the earth, their attention constantly disrupted by the necessities of the body, their relationship to the divine causes them to have a strange, I think, relationship on that road within that domain, because they are in likeness to the divine and other people. So we meet each other on the path to that connected source. And I think, and I view our interactions much along this path. And so if we imagine that man and his interaction with other men are not entirely physical, that they can be spiritual, that they can depend on what we might consider, the heart may help us here, a divine impulse or divine insight, or perhaps an aspect of awareness, of mindedness, an aspect of the ability to create, to have the generative capacity, and to make that which was previously not realized become realized. Within this domain, I think the spirits have they have interesting powers. Now, if we imagine this road, if it is possible to imagine that in the spiritual realm there is no gravity, and that the road is completely vertical. I'm tracing it out here on my notepad. And in that vertical experience, on one side perhaps we have the value of man, which I think would provide us with intrinsic, principled descriptions or qualities of man's experience that are not necessarily dependent on position, that of all men at their level of interface with the world and with the spiritual domain, they have this value. And much like the beginning of the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, when we are discussing, characterizing or describing identities, we can do so at various different levels. And of the various levels, we attribute to them some name, some category. So for example, we can include a horse and a man under a certain category, and yet it would be a broad enough category to include them, but to exclude perhaps a rock or something that is other than biological. And then we can imagine identities that get more and more specific. In this bizarrely fascinating but also quite dangerous deductive process and almost reduction back up towards the whole. So, as far as man's interface goes, his value is constant. He has, and perhaps this is me attributing, but I'm going out on a limb here to say that there's a certain value, and maybe this is a modern conception, I doubt it, there's a certain value that man has, because he is man, and that cannot be taken away by virtue of another's position. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that position is not important, nor does it disqualify perhaps what this verse is trying to tell us. So the question then becomes, well, if there's a certain aspect of man's, and the totality of man and his internal character or his being that holds value, that holds weight, that cannot be destroyed, even among the differences in position, that it remains constant at a certain level, at a certain layer, then what does it necessarily mean then for a man to hold a position that is higher than another? This is something that I've gone over in detail on the last episode. There are certain elements, much like the elements that I had mentioned about the spirit, certain qualities, that it is immaterial, that it is immortal. There are more, surely. It's a conduit towards the divine logos. Of those that are in higher authority, perhaps they possess greater power, perhaps they had ascended to that level on just grounds, perhaps they had done so on unjust grounds. It doesn't really matter. We're thinking about the concept of the differences in this hierarchy. Man is an interesting creature in that he develops his societies, and there are many different niches that form. There are plenty of different pockets, almost like if we imagine the formal realm like this realm that is just full of water that's flowing into different pockets and places that are opened for that pressure to fill into. I think of human society in this way, and that there is always going to be these pockets of authority that are opened that must be filled in order to maintain a society, even if we have a governing structure that is completely independent of human action, like an artificial intelligence managing system that takes care of roads, it It does a lot of the bureaucratic management of things. It's responsible for the delegation of funds to various institutions like the police and perhaps health and fire. Perhaps it even helps and assists in the collection of taxation and in the provisions for the maintenance of a society's identity, which would perhaps be in lockstep with a legislator. It's hard to say. I don't want to get too lost in the science fiction aspect of this, but even in that situation, if man is to be in a society that is his society, even if he is to be a slave, he occupies a position. Now, that being said, that this is as much a natural quality as the dispersion of water into the places of least resistance, as within the spiritual domain, the dispersion of responsibility and the acceptance of that responsibility to places that are necessary in order to hold the structure, to hold the, you think of a building here that holds the building up, a bunch of I-beams that are necessary to support the various things that are inside of the building or the structure itself. In terms of man's society, there will be certain men or collections of men that form these I-beams to support the structure of the society, of the culture, whatever. And these positions are always going to be filled. And it's not a matter of power or subjection or any of this, even though that these are elements of that experience, the possibilities of that experience. We need not focus too heavily on these sorts of things. What I am concerned with here is how a person of higher authority, and in the context of this verse we're talking about the king, relates to a person of lower authority, and what it would necessarily mean for a person of lower authority to enter into the presence of that of the person in the higher authority. Now, presence is the key word here, because what does that mean? This is why I didn't want to get into the conversation about the physical, because a person can enter into the physical room of a king and quickly be kicked out. But I suppose that there's a road into a broader philosophical discussion here, because the question is, well, why would an individual that just sort of has a regular, everyday existence not be allowed to enter the king's throne room? And I think that the reason for that is the interaction of these positions, that there is something that enters into the king by way of the relationship that ought not to enter into that bubble, that ought not to enter into the position of that authority. There are many situations, many stories throughout history in which a king is influenced by his subjects in one way or another. Whether it's the king that is influenced by a powerful nobility, or a king that is influenced by a jester, perhaps, or a family member. Perhaps it is a family member that has taken power, that rules over a society under the name of the king. Perhaps the king is an infant, for example. I think of Chinese history that this has happened in. And so there's a strange nominal component to that. There's perhaps a misuse of language and a symbolic reorganization in terms of the kingship. And I think it is much like my conversation about the verse 4 and verse 5, take away the dross from the silver, and there shall come forth a vessel for the finer. Verse 5, take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. The common thread here is that the dross, or the impurities that enter into the throne of the king, will pervert the way in which the position is occupied, and therefore it will pervert the way in which the the responsibilities are accepted, the apportionment of the actionable element of the king's authority will be negatively influenced by this wicked influence. Now, it begs the question, the king is not a saint, although they occupy this position of authority, and so there may be a situation, much like there may be a situation, in which the wicked or the dross may enter into the position of the king, but there also may be a situation in which the position of the king is nothing but dross and needs more silver, it needs more purity, it needs more value. And to this, it brings up an interesting question, but the question isn't entirely related to what we're talking about here, because again, we're talking about position. Now, of course, in simplest terms, what is being said here is don't accept a responsibility that you know that you are unable to uphold, or that you're just purely incompetent to exercise that authority. I don't think it's suggesting that we should not accept responsibility or test ourselves and continually test ourselves by accepting positions of authority or of responsibility in order to grow and to learn. But since I am not the king, and most people that are going to be reading this are not a king, we do not put ourselves in the presence of the king, because if we were to do that, we would be sharing in that responsibility. To some level we do, because we participate in the society. But again, there's an identity that needs to be upheld there. There's a certain point or place at which there's a relationship at which the king no longer becomes the king. The position is dissolved. And what happens is, who knows what? It's chaos takes place. Maybe something better takes place. Who knows? So we can say that perhaps in the ancient sense, since this is what they knew, and I don't want to be pejorative because I don't think this is, my thought isn't, but we all have a certain conception, a certain understanding or map of where the various positions of experience are, the various positions of authority are in our society. There are periods in which we may be less certain than others, maybe by corruption or by wickedness that enters in and deceives a lot of people, so nobody can really tell because the people that are doing the deceiving actually want the authority. But I think what we really are concerned with here is the maintenance and the proper attention placed to an identity. And the identity of a king, and this is something that I struggle with sometimes, the identity of the king is perhaps something that is a constant of nature. We can think of the king in terms of God, in terms of Christ. We can think of various kings that have propped up that have been literally labeled kings. The year of human existence is long to the perspective of a particular individual, and I think there have been many rises and falls in the way in which man organizes himself, and perhaps the king is one of these fundamental forms of organization that just comes about given enough time. It's really hard for me to say. But even if it is not a fundamental, even if it is something that is of an important placeholder to examine the map of position and authority, I think it's a useful exercise. Put not forth yourself in the presence of the king, and stand not in the place of great men. Now, I want to reiterate, I don't think that this verse is suggesting not to be a great person, but a great person becomes a great person. They carve this place out in the intelligible domain. It is not something that they sort of take over by force, because a great man cannot take over a position of a great man unless they are a great man. This is the domain of that which is. The deception here may blind our eyes, but to the eyes of God and to the eyes of the level of experience that we are endowed with, we are allowed to see at least this much into this domain, such that we can recognize when there is a false apportionment of authority or a position to somebody that is actually not in a position of authority or place to be able to accept the charge. And here I think of the relationship or the opposition of two words, that of the word nominal and that of the word real or actual. So I should mention that today is a new day. I had a particularly uncharacteristic break between this last recording and the one now. It's been a few days. But that is because I went on a trip, a camping trip. It was a good experience, a lot of reflection and conversation, for which I am thankful for. But as I return to this now, undeniably, I think some of that experience will come back into my interpretation here. So, in terms of the character of this recording, it might seem a bit different, but that is why. One being a new day, and then two following this camping experience. So, as I remember, I'm still on verse 6. Put not forth yourself in the presence of the king, and stand not in the place of great men. I had finished getting myself to the point of, again, thinking about the map of intelligibility and man's ability to carve out different places for himself and for the collective, just generally speaking, man's experience in the intelligible domain. These themes had come up a lot in my reflection and conversations in on the camping trip. It seems like one of those things that's quite simple, but then once the mind begins to consider this map, things seem to be more visible, easier to understand. Now, to reiterate, positionally, it can be a bit of a puzzle to determine exactly how one ought to be related to a particular position and how one ought to occupy a particular position. There are a number of different scenarios, circumstances that we can devise and to walk through. But I'm not sure that this would be the most productive path. Rather, I would like to close out this verse 6, and before we get into verse 7, which is directly related, by maybe giving a couple of statements about the last half of the verse. Stand not in the place of great men. I've already mentioned that I don't think this verse is implying that the reader cannot be a great man or should not be a great man. It is more so if I were to step in for a police officer. I know nothing about that business. I'm not trained to do it. I don't know the law well enough to be able to follow through with that or to communicate with the various elements. And because of that, if I were to stand in that place, just forget about the great man for a moment. There are many great police officers, but this is the category, the identification that we are asked to consider is a bit more general and more principled than that of the position of a police officer. But that being said, I should still be able to appreciate the through line in this particular example. So the reason that I should not occupy the position of the police officer is not necessarily because I can't. I can at some point. But it's based on certain requirements. There are certain characteristics that I need to incorporate into myself before being able to accurately identify with that distinction. Now the key, the goodness, is in the accuracy. It is in the accuracy of identification of the principles, the load-bearing elements that form the identity. Now this is nothing new. I know that I've explored this territory before, but this is something that I would like to stay or keep in mind moving forward. And the remainder is that this position is carved out by behavior rather than by want or desire. It is sort of, desire and want can be a part of it, but I think it's largely independent. It is doing the action, it is establishing the principles such that this is carved out into the minds of others, carved into the collective fabric of the society, whatever. For a great person is exceptional, distinguished, considerable, prominent, above the average. Now here, it's a bit more obvious. If one reflects on one's desire to be something, it doesn't make them something. The desire can be an aspect of it, but it's the action and the steps, the way to get there, the actual execution that causes a man to be great. Now, before the recording ended, I had mentioned the distinction between nominalism and realism, I guess, actuality. And I think where these two terms come into play is in the recognition of one's true place in a position, accurately identifying the characteristics that make up that position, and then comparing if the person that is occupying that space is actually appropriately in that place or position. For better it is that it be said unto you, Come up here, than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen. So an interesting follow-up to verse 6. For better it is that it be said to you, Come up here. So, what would this imply in the first instance? We're talking about position. So, in this situation, in my interpretation, if somebody is to say something to me, we're imagining this mental domain, and then I am ascending a type of hierarchy. I think what is likely is that ascending this hierarchy means accepting greater responsibility, having a greater degree of understanding, or at least that's one of the prerequisites to holding a position that is higher in that value structure. So this call, this asking to come up, seems like an invitation by those who are more elevated in that hierarchy. And the question that comes to my mind is there more than just this? Because if one is not called to a position of higher authority, at least by his fellow man, it doesn't necessarily mean that he can't occupy the space. And so I wonder if this call is more of a divine calling rather than one for man. But I suppose that a call for man could provoke a divine impulse. But regardless of where it comes from, I think I have to reasonably consider that not every type of invitation would be the accurate type to ascend the hierarchy. Because if we have a position that is just nominally occupied, and it is not truly held by a person who is responsible and understanding of the principles that are entailed with that position, then the position and the value that is produced by it will be minimal. It will be poor. For better it is that it be said to you, "Come up here," than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen. So here again we see the word presence. As in verse 6, put not forth yourself in the presence of the king. And I'm reminded to consider that being in the presence of the prince or of the king, whatever it happens to be, is more so than just the material observations. There is plenty to pick up in the presence of somebody. We are sharing that space of existence and that space of mind. The next thing that I'm interested in here is the expression of being put lower. Now my mind gets caught up in what it means to be put lower, of course. What might be the behavior of the prince? What might be the behavior of the individual that we are being prompted to consider? This is ourselves, that we, at least when I read this, I insert myself into the instruction. Whenever it says you, I think of myself. But if I am to be put lower, what would necessarily that mean? Now, in terms of position and the responsibility therein that one undertakes and accepts, my position as a commoner relative to this prince would mean that I have certain social responsibilities, just as the prince does, but we differ based on the type of responsibilities that we accept. Now, this distinction, this classification of what is lower and higher, still hasn't been satisfactorily answered. I mentioned this responsibility as being one of the key determinants of the separation between the two positions. I think it's a large component, but there's something that tells me that this is not near enough. Another way perhaps that I can think about this is thinking about an analogy that I've used before, and that is of any structure, of any building, of the components that exist within. There are many components that interact together to give the building its structural support. There are many elements individually that provide strong support. I think of iron versus a smaller 2x4. There are different situations in which an I-beam would be used versus a 2x4. And all the same, despite there being a large I-beam that supports the majority of the weight of a particular floor versus the door frame and the wood molding that goes around it, which is more of an aesthetic thing rather than it is a structural thing, it still occupies the aesthetic position Now, the structural position is different in its purpose. And by its difference in its purpose, it's different in its responsibility. Wood molding is responsible for making the building look nice, for making it seem habitable. The purpose of the I-beam is to support the structure of the building. In this situation, if I were to be given the decision to remove the I-beam or to remove the wood molding around the door, I would have to say that I would remove the wood molding, because the position that the I-beam occupies is more important than the wood molding. It's more important because of its purpose. Now, in terms of man, I suppose it's somewhat more complicated, but at a certain level, I think it's a direct parallel. And by that I mean, unlike the I-beam and the wood frame analogy, the absolute value between human beings, I think, is relatively the same. But that the position that they occupy will necessarily make their worth different. But it's an aspect of their worth. It is not their soul that we are trying to rob from somebody when we consider the difference in purposes. A society or any number of institutions that we can consider are formed of structural elements. They are formed of people occupying certain positions such that it would allow the institution or the society to run. And by this, we can draw that exact analogy between the I-beam and the wood frame around the door. Or wood molding, I should say. Now, if I were to ask the question, well then, in the case of what we see here in the Proverbs, is it the case that if we were to be given a decision between myself and the prince, what would be gotten rid of? And the answer would be me, my position. But it is not because, first I would say it's not me in totality that it's getting rid of, it's getting rid of the position. I, as a human being, would occupy some other position if it needed to be gotten rid of in this example. But the point is that my position and my purpose is not lofty enough to threaten the society or a particular institution. Now, my absolute value is fixed. It's unchanging. It is like some material object that is extremely dependable on the market, and it really doesn't shift much. And because it doesn't shift much, because there is certainty that there will be very little change in that condition, that it makes it a safe investment, perhaps. I view the nature of man and the soul of man like this. It is something that is constant, it is stable, it is something that we will always value. It is the fundamental building block of our societies. So what we are left with here is a situation in which we are told or prompted to consider that it is better to be invited up to a new position than it is to find ourselves in the presence of one that occupies a position and then to be brought low or to be humbled by it. And early on, when I had read this proverb, I was thinking about the concept of humility. And now that I think about it a little bit more, it's starting to become a little bit more clear at what I think it is pointing to. Because when I mentioned humility in the second instance, in which I find myself in front of this prince, and I am a bit out of my league, I don't necessarily understand what his day is like, I don't understand his responsibilities, and perhaps I'm a bit arrogant in my interactions with this person. And as a result, I am humbled. Now, this is a good thing, I think, in and of itself. We'll get to the verse in a moment. But first, I would like to consider exactly what it means to be humbled. Now, the roots of the word humble, or humility, are... It suggests that we are being brought low, we are being grounded. And there's a certain way in which we can interpret being brought low in a negative way, in a negative sense. But being brought low in the situation of an arrogant person is to bring their mind outside of the pedestal of pride, to bring it down off that pedestal into something that is real, something that is come to by reason, that they have a position that is formed by many different decisions that they've made in their life, and that they are responsible for their position in life, whether it be for where they are or what it is that they do given where they are. And I should just as easily say that instead of the word they, I should be saying I, as I started out with. There's another aspect of humility which brings in the word modesty, but I think I'd sort of describe this a little bit in terms of the avoidance of pride as the driving factor, as the elevating factor. The elevation should come from not personal inflation, because as we know with money, especially these days in 2024, you inflate the monetary supply, the value of the currency goes down. You inflate the worth of a person's position with pride, the value of that person's position goes down. Now, there is a distinct difference between position and the value of the human being, like the value of the soul. And when I say position, I don't necessarily mean occupation. I think occupation is a part of it. But position is more so, it is spiritual to a degree. It involves understanding, and it involves awareness about where their mind is in the broader domain of the intelligible sphere, intelligible space. Now, in this verse, when I read, "In the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen," what my eyes are seeing actually is not just the prince that may be dressed in some royal outfit, or in at least better, more put together clothes than I am, but more so, I see what he does. I see who he is. I see what the consequences of his actions are. I see how widespread this might be. I see how related he is to other people in other positions. I compare this to myself. And at some level of sense-making, I should understand that I probably shouldn't be in the presence of the prince unless there is an honest and justified reason to be. And if I start out humble, I start out lowly, I start out principled, and understand who I am and what I do, then if there is some calling, there is some invitation by a prince or by a king, then I accept. And it will not be by virtue of their position that I am brought low, but because of my own recognition of the way that things are. Now, if it was not this way, if I had very poor recognition of the way things are, and I had inserted myself higher up into that hierarchy without the invitation, then I would be brought low, and given the mind that approaches a situation in this way, that type of humbling may be too much. It may not be appreciated or accepted. Hopefully it will. We all sort of desire this sort of thing. We desire justice. But it would seem that this verse is warning us against entering into the type of behavior such that we are absent or void of humility when approaching the large map of human organization, the intelligible sphere, the intelligible domain. Go not forth hastily to strive, lest you know not what to do in the end thereof, when your neighbor has put you to shame. Okay, so let's break down this verse. Starting with the first portion, go not forth hastily to strive. What can be said of this? There is an indication that haste is of prime importance. It would seem that it would be unreasonable to think that striving is the thing for which we are instructed not to do, but rather the quality of doing it quickly, suddenly, without proper preparation. I think we are prompted to consider. Now, certainly there are certain situations where haste is of necessity, but where we can prevent it, the question is, why should we take any road other than the fast road? And I suppose the answer may lie within our ability to take in information. Every one of us is a bit different. We all have different capacities for retaining information. But if I'm driving down a road at 10 miles an hour versus 80 miles an hour, I certainly would be able to pick up more of the environment moving at 10 miles an hour versus 80, assuming that my level of attention is the same in both situations. Now, this is important because considering a particular dilemma or a problem, or just generally the path of life, on which, of course, there are plenty of problems and dilemmas, processing information, synthesizing information, reflecting on information is fundamental to making wise decisions. But the question is why? Why is it fundamental to making wise decisions? Well, it doesn't appear that this is a very difficult answer. The wise person is one that wishes to understand the world, understand reality, understand himself as it is, and not be deceived by false information or by false integration of information. And in order to ensure that we are properly building an adequate illustration or projection map of the environment such that we can make effective decisions, it takes time, and there must be a process by which we come to some certainty. The judge and the jury, that is in a courthouse, do not deliberate on cases for purposes of expedience, but rather on the basis and on the grounds of evidence. And that evidence must be skillfully reported by the lawyers, and this is not dependent on time. This is something that needs to be skillfully put together and then unfolded for others to see, even if the event in question occurred over a matter of seconds. Go not forth hastily to strive, lest you know not what to do in the end thereof. Now, what is the end in this situation? Perhaps we have either obtained what we wished, the result of our striving, or perhaps because of our haste, we failed to obtain the thing that we wish, that we desired to obtain. I think regardless of the situation, what we can say is that because of the haste, because of the expedience, because of the lack of foresight, we are unable to determine what purpose lies beyond the immediate. As if the immediacy was the focus of the striving, rather than the end. And it would be such a strange thing, a peculiar thing, to reach an end of some pursuit and not understand why one has reached that place or received some material object. When your neighbor has put you to shame. So, of course, a neighbor is somebody that literally means a near dweller, somebody that is close to you. And this putting of one to shame is a removal or a lowering of one's position to a place that they maybe are not used to, or they feel that that lowering of position has made them appear foolish. And that appearance of foolishness is causing this well of emotion, of embarrassment. But the result, I think, is to be humbled, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But if it's unexpected and sudden, if it's quick, then it can certainly be associated with these embarrassing, the sinking emotions. And so the question in my mind is, well, why would the neighbor put one to shame? Is it because of the actions of the neighbor? Or is it because of the observation on the part of the person that doesn't understand what to do once they've reached an end because of their haste? Observing the neighbor's behavior, knowing what to do once they've reached an end because they are more judicious and not foolish. I think either or can be a result of this situation. But both of them share commonalities. That is, regardless of the recognition on the part of the neighbor or on the part of the hasty person, the realization that one has done something foolish or has made some observation, integrated information in such a way that is not in accordance with the way that things are or the way that things should be, will prompt the heart to express these uncomfortable emotions that we associate with shame. Debate your cause with your neighbor himself, and discover not a secret to another, lest he that hears it put you to shame, and your infamy turn not away. So this is following in a similar vein. These two verses go together, verse 9 and verse 10. So we're going to begin with the first. Debate your cause with your neighbor himself, and discover not a secret to another. So with that first bit, debate your cause with your neighbor himself. There's an implication here that finding the principle or the root of one's concern and putting that forth without having some superficial deception surround it, and having that principle put forth to the person that one is talking to solely, again without external influence, I think is the main idea behind the first part of this verse. For the second half says, and discover not a secret to another. And so again, I'll revert back to what I had just said. And it's the important bit is found within the cause, not so much debate. Because the debate will be this disinterested conversation based on the principle. Now, if the information that is brought in characterizes it in a light that is anything other than the cause, that we are giving opinions about things that really don't necessarily matter, they don't really influence the cause at all. Again, they're superficial. It could be the person involved, it could be the way the person looks, or the way the person has behaved in the past. The root is much more straightforward, barren to the degree that it is in absence of that which would tempt us to think or to jump to conclusions hastily. The first verse comes to mind here. Go not forth hastily to strive, lest you know not what to do in the end thereof, when your neighbor has put you to shame. And so if we hastily go through a dilemma with somebody that is close to us, we give sporadic information that is somewhat related, perhaps not really, we do a disservice to the cause. And we sacrifice the principle for the haste in our strivings. And then once we get to the end of it, we are discovering an aspect of what we believe about another person, or what we believe about ourselves, or the way that we approach problem solving in general, that would lead us to be humbled. Now, being humbled is not a bad thing, but we should start in a place of humility rather than deceive ourselves in a position that is higher and then be brought lower because of our ignorance. Debate your cause with your neighbor himself, and discover not a secret to another, lest he that hears it put you to shame. Now, this is what I just said. So, the listening for that information will be integrated in that mind, independent of our own, obviously. And we have to be ready, if we are free from this arrogance, that whatever is going to be proposed on that side of the debate stage is actually towards the cause, towards the principle, and not towards something that is revealing of something that we had approached our neighbor in deception. And that road may be long and straight into the darkness, something perhaps that we wished that we would not reveal, and yet we are perhaps going to somebody for reflection that may help us, but we wish not to share all. It is in the deception that we find ourselves out of the realm of humility. And we open ourselves up to this unfortunate experience, unfortunate emotion that we contribute to shame. And it's easy to identify why exactly a negative reputation would result from this type of behavior, from deceiving one's neighbor, and to unveil, perhaps explicitly or inadvertently, a secret that was meant to be kept away from the neighbor. For an act of taking information and using it in a way to devalue somebody's perception, devalue in the sense that their perception is now reduced, that they understand something less by the result of the inputs that we have provided, making somebody believe something that is not true. This is cause for our own standing, social or otherwise, to be reduced. And this is, I think, the reasonable way in which we are reduced, or that we are humbled back to a place for which we are reminded that our behavior, or that we are corrected in the sense that we ought not to use language and information in such a way to bring somebody away from the truth, but rather towards the truth. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. So it would seem that we are given quite a large landscape here to explore. A word that is fitly spoken. Now, I think about scenarios in which I might encounter a word that is fitly spoken. And although in my mind at this moment I cannot draw up a particular example, I am sure that I've experienced it before, sort of a strange feeling that exists within me. That a fitly spoken word is akin to a melody, perhaps, or a series of notes that just seem to make sense or provoke some sort of profound sense of something. It is something that we really don't need to understand. It is something that we experience. And by that experience, we understand that what has occurred is beautiful. It fits. For if we are to say that something fits, that means it is appropriate. If something is to be appropriate, it is to be suitable or proper given the circumstance. It is relevant. And by this relevance, by this appropriateness, what we have is an establishment of some connection. And now I wonder at what exactly about the fittedness causes us to attend to it, to find it beautiful. Now we could say that there is something within the symmetry, something that I've just mentioned in the connectedness. I am geared towards asserting that there is something within the connection, the way something is connected to another thing, that causes it to be attractive, that causes it to be beautiful. It causes it to make sense. Now, of course, we can take any material object and we can examine it for beauty, we can ask ourselves where is the beauty in a particular object? Now, if I grab an object in front of me, what I have is, I believe, what is called a power brick. It's an Apple charging device that has a USB input and a plug at the posterior aspect of the device. It is solid white for the most part. There is breaks in its character that affords certain elements to interact and connect with other elements. I may find, I think, fittedness and appropriateness within this device, but also between things that it articulates with. For example, the cord that would then go to my phone, or the outlet that I plug the device into. And it seems to me to be a difficult question to ask, well, what about this device in particular, regardless of its connections, is beautiful? There are many things that I can point out that might have some evidence to support its beauty. For example, it is relatively close to a square. It has nice rounded edges to it. It feels soft, or smooth, I should say. By the same token, I can also say that because there is this break in continuity for the portion of the plug, that there is something disharmonious about it, and that this doesn't really represent true fittedness because of its lack of continuity, its lack of continuation, perhaps. And by this reasoning, I think I can move around this cube, and I can identify various aspects and support them in support of beauty or in support of disunity, disharmony, what one might consider ugliness to be. And so I think there's something about this approach that isn't quite right when examining fittedness. My mind, again, easily gets lost in the vast potential of things that one can find beautiful and the vast potential of things that one would find unfitting or poorly organized or irrelevant. And my mind from this place goes to, well, its fittedness may be best appreciated by its purpose, and that is to charge a cell phone. And in that respect, under that analysis, I think we can appreciate the beauty of the device. It is solid. It is easy to manipulate. It does an effective job at what its purpose is, at its function. Aesthetically, it is not terribly ugly to look at. And so it seems there's an aspect of mind, a prerequisite of attention, that is related to finding the fittedness in the material world. As I mentioned, we can pay attention to many different aspects of this device, of this material object. We can examine its physical form, independent of its function or its purpose, and we can examine its form with regard to its function and its purpose. But when I hear a piece of music that catches me, it's not necessarily a matter of pure analysis, whether or not the piece is truly beautiful, because this can vary, I suppose, at least to the degree that this reflection would suggest. That is to say that perhaps I hear a particular piece of music at a particular time in my day, under particular circumstances. Different events are happening, and then I hear the exact same piece of music at a different time in that day. Again, under different circumstances. Different events are happening. I am participating with the world and the environment in a different way than I had in the former time or the former experience. And while there may be something consistent about the piece of music that catches my ear, it may be the case that my emotions or my attention is stirred more so in the second instance than in the first. And by this, I think it would be reasonable to suggest that although it may be difficult to tie down exactly what it is about an object or a melody that is beautiful, and while it's difficult to tie down beauty in the absence of something that can be changed or something that should be added to enhance the experience, what I think we are left with is a broader picture of experience of participation. The circumstantial is not to be overestimated here. That of the differing possibilities for which one can find themselves in a space, ready to accept a particular type of relatedness among notes or relatedness among atoms in a physical object, this is a precious moment. We could say it depends on the subject, which of course it does, because the subject is formulating and visualizing the environment. The subject is an active participant in the experience that the material object or the piece of music affords. Now it's quite obvious to imagine that the words that we use must be used in a particular order in order for them to convey a meaning. It's almost as if we wish to cross a bridge, and yet the materials that are meant to make up the bridge are scattered and disorganized. Much like if I took the words of this verse and I shook them up and it randomized them, or perhaps the letters, to make it even more challenging. The verse would quickly lose its meaning, much like the bridge would quickly lose its purpose, and I cannot cross the river. And so, with this in view, that of circumstance, that of context, that of the role and the participation of the observer, the individual, the subject, I should say, we also consider the purpose. We consider the meaning and the function. And the better something is fitted, the better something is organized, the better it is at satisfying the purpose that is intended for it. Now, the purpose for the bridge is easy to identify. It is to move from point A to point B across some obstacle, whether it be a river or some concavity between two large projections of the earth. Now, in the case of the human being, it's difficult for me to say exactly what the purpose is intended for it. I can say a number of different things that may satisfy this, to serve God or to bring the creative element into the material world, to raise the earthly substrate into the heavenly domain such that it is endowed with meaning and purpose. Perhaps that's a good start, but ultimately my purpose is of course influenced by me, but to a large degree I am influenced by my Creator, as if I were a bridge created to facilitate some movement of people across it from point A to point B. So what is the word but a medium of exchange for man's thoughts, what he believes to be valuable? Perhaps we can say the creative element, for mind is an interesting thing to consider, especially in relationship to material substrate. As I sit here and I think about my own thoughts, it doesn't matter to me whether or not the material interactions are somehow prerequisite for my existence and being. My thoughts are for themselves. They are something that exists, seemingly only heard by me, but perhaps by much more than just me. And as I speak, as I exchange, or as I put forth value, however little or however large it may be, there is this constancy of fittedness of the words that I put together, for which greater and greater value can flow down into them. A word fitly spoken, like apples, is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. The question that I have for the second half of this verse: is there anything that can be interpreted from apples of gold and pictures of silver? Or is this just a series of words to represent something that ought to be seen as valuable, or pretty, beautiful? Now, of an apple, it's interesting that the author would wish it to be made of gold. An apple is something that is nourishing for the body, that is something that is consumable, yet materially valuable, independent of the value that is attributed to it by its consumability. For gold is not necessarily something that we can consume. It is something that is materially valuable, independent of nourishing consumption. And so we have two types of value: the maintenance of existence, and also the grounding of value in the material world, in the gold. And it would seem that this is a bit of a microcosm for man, that the golden apple, the apple symbolizing life, and again, existence, or the nourishing element, accompanied with a precious material that allows it to be alive, that allows it to express that principle of nourishment. And all of this that is wrapped in a broader, materially beautiful world or universe that we find ourselves in, these pictures of silver. As an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold, so is a wise reprover upon an obedient ear. As an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold. Now, in the first instance, I think of these sorts of things quite superficially, like they don't really mean much. But of course the objects retain a lot of physical value, surely for their size. They outprice many material objects, including many apples. And so just as in the material domain, where things can be seen as beautiful, as additive to the physical beauty of something, we also imagine that the wise words, the fittedness, the rightly apportioned attention and thoughts, these serve as a corrective mechanism to the mind that wishes to be and wishes to do. There are many wishes, but not all wishes, of course, not all desires, of course, are the types of longing or experiences that would lead us to some fruitful outcome, or lead us to righteousness, for example. And an obedient ear is one that is willing to accept correction to the most fundamental of levels. Because in order to accept true correction, one must recognize true fittedness and true beauty. Much like one would understand the purpose of a decoration to enhance the physical attractiveness of an object or of a person. As the cold of snow in the time of harvest, so is a faithful messenger to them that send him, for he refreshes the soul of his masters. So, today is a new day. It was a long day at work. I'm a bit exhausted. But I'm glad to be in front of this book yet again. Now, the first part of this verse, of the whole verse actually, has me in a bit of confusion. As the cold of snow in the time of harvest. Now, I'm no farmer, but from what I understand living in the Midwest, that harvest season, at least for the corn, begins in fall or late summer. And it is certainly possible to see snow during this period. But the question that I have in my mind is, why would the snow in the time of harvest be seen as a positive thing? Because it is compared to the faithful messenger, because he is the one that refreshes the soul of his masters. Perhaps I should say, because of this association, we know it's positive. Now, it's possible that what we are seeing here is a sign of the change in seasons. It could be a sign that is associated with the change in season that is also associated with the period of harvest. The period of harvest, of course, is a reaping of seeds that are sown, product of one's labor. And there is this adjective, refreshing, that is used in the context of this messenger. If we reverse this verse, we say, okay, well, the role of the messenger brings about this refreshing effect to the seat of being of man. There must be a refreshing quality to the first snow in harvest season, that perhaps because of the hard work and the labor that is associated with that, the hot summer sun. As we move into the fall and into the winter, when the snow begins to fall, we experience this refreshing sensation, this relief, and the sign that our labors can now be put at rest, or we can rest from our labor. Now, a faithful messenger is one that will go to their destination, that will transmit information dependably, that one need not worry if they're going to send, let's say, in the modern context, sending a text message. We don't think much about the reliability of the messaging apparatus. We take it for granted that the cell towers are picking up this information and transmitting it. But if we had poor connectivity and sending a message was not so straightforward, perhaps we were in a situation that is far from any cell tower and we don't have reception, of course, this situation would be an unreliable messenger. The information would not get through to whoever we wanted to communicate with. And in a broader sense, in a more principled sense, the transmission of information and the variability that exists therein is fundamental to man's being. Now, why is it the case? What can we say of man's being? Now, I say this because the verse mentions the refreshment of the soul, that the messenger, the transmitter of information, has brought this effect, the result of his good actions, his good work, his good deed, has brought upon a positive reflection on the state of being of man. Now, I've classified that the soul is the seat of man's being. It is the place for which the type of agent that man is interfaces with the broader agentic arena, the arena of mind, the intelligible sphere, for which the creator of the whole, the unity of the whole, the divine logos, that perceptual awareness, that moreness that is afforded to us by this mind that we have that seems not necessarily independent of material reality, but it is something that transcends the immediate and the earthly into something that is more purposeful and meaningful. I suppose we can ask the question, well, why is there this positive reflection on the state of man, which seems to be a bit of an extension of what we were talking about, or a overinflation of what we were talking about, of what's mentioned in the verse, I should say. But I've extended it because to compare the transmission, the successful transmission of some message by a messenger to the refreshment of the soul of the masters is quite a projection. It is quite a length to cover in terms of a logical chain of why that might be. And since I've mentioned that the soul is this interface, or it is the part of man that is the connection to that immaterial realm, the realm of mind, the intelligible sphere, the agentic arena, that when information is transmitted or some symbol is recognized or some pattern is recognized, something dependable is provided or a burden is lifted because, again, of some successful transmission of information. What we are seeing here is, I think, in some sense, a move closer to that divine unity. Because
If we imagine the state that's prior to the refreshment of the soul, we would have to imagine that we can say perhaps that it is burdened. It is in a state of fatigue, a state of exhaustion. All of these different states would likely be a prerequisite to one being refreshed. And in the case of the soul, much like a highway, or just generally a road that has a lot of traffic on it, congestion is something that slows passage. The burdens that we carry through our lives, the dramatization of our relationships that we keep close to our hearts, I think oftentimes this sort of thing leads us to misunderstanding what our relationship is to the world, to the broader world, not just the earth, not just the material, but to the broader agentic arena, and towards the source that has caused us to be. And any time that either we are relieved for a moment by a cool breeze in the late summer or the harvest season, or whether it be a pattern of seasonal change that indicates to us that our hard work is coming to an end, or if it be something that we can rely on and depend on because we know it will be done, we know that our message will be received by the recipient that we intend. These moments are like decongestion. They're like clearing the plaque out of the arteries. It is like removing the accident from the highway, such that the flow of traffic opens up and everybody continues at their proper speed. It is as if man and his relationship to the divine has been restored. It has been refreshed. It has been cleansed. And in that way, his recognition of the higher purposes towards what truly matters, towards a general appreciation for being connected to that thing that we can perceive but often place in the background because of our own personal worries, our temporal worries. Whoso boasteth himself of a false gift is like clouds and wind without rain. So I would like to begin by talking about this word gift and really inflating it with value. Because I think the word gift is the axis of this verse. Surely I'm interested in getting into the analogy, that of the clouds and wind without rain aspect, but this false gift is quite important to understand. Now, at one level, I think mostly everybody will understand what it means to have a false gift and interpret it as such. Or to boast of a false gift, I should say. But this gift I find to be an interesting sort of thing. It is something that it would seem that somebody can possess. It is something that is given. It implies a fundamental aspect of human interaction. There are different ways in which a gift can be given or can be received. But the two main things that I would like to focus on is the act of giving and then the transmission of the thing. It could be an object or it could be information that is exchanged. Both of which I think are required when we say the word gift, or at least it's implied, because there is also the aspect of saying the word gift that may referred to the thing that was transmitted, and in our modern day context, it's likely to be some material object. But I think there's much more, as I've just mentioned, that goes into this word gift. So where to begin? I think we should begin with the beginning. That is the act of giving, the transmission, and not necessarily the thing, idea, object, whatever that is being transmitted. So what is this act of giving? What does it signify? In the first instance, I would like to propose that it is an act of will. It is something that comes from within us. It is a decision that we make. To give up something, to surrender, to sacrifice something. Now these words have large implications, big meaning to them. But to move further down into the aspect of will, that part of us that makes a decision. Now I'm debating exactly what road to follow here, because of will and of this decision. It's important to understand exactly, at least I think it's important to understand, where we are as agents in making this decision. And what comes to mind is the freedom of will. Now, this is somewhat of a contentious topic. I don't necessarily think that it's all that fruitful to discuss true freedom of will or not. I believe that we have it, but the arguments for and against are often lacking and unproductive. But just imagining our plane of existence and our general perception and ability to act in the world, although we may be influenced by forces that we don't understand, and that our reason and willful direction is only one aspect of everything that moves us. I do wish to focus on this reasonable component, the reasonable component and the maybe what can be called the emotional component or the heartfelt component, both of which contribute to our overall expression. And to the degree that this is possible, again, that part of ourselves that is independent, that is an agent with some identity, that is not just purely a product of forces that play upon it to do their bidding in the world, of this agent and of the constituent elements that make up its identity, or just its identity in general, I think is the place that we ought to start and consider. But of course in this domain it's fascinating. It's a bit barren until we turn on the light and examine that there's really much more to be had there than just a basic reflection on an agent that exists and has some action in the world. For we are really trying to narrow down what it means to give a gift to somebody, or have a gift, give a gift, whatever it is. So of this agent, of the boundary that surrounds it, of the constituent elements that make it up, of the various principles that allow it to be, the question that comes to mind is, how significant
are these principles in contributing to what the agent decides? Well, if the principles are of the agent, that they are the fundamental aspects of the agent, much like the supporting structures of a house, that without them the house would not stand and it would fall, it would cease to have a coherent identity, then of course these things are necessary to make the decision. But here we face a dilemma of scale and of level. Because it can be said that the structures that support the house are necessary to keep the house upright, again, to support it, but they play a particular role in the broader identity of the thing. Those support principles, each one in and of themselves, would not be the identity of the thing. The identity is the conglomeration of all the various elements. Now, in the example of the house, we have the material elements that then give rise to the home, for which the family occupies and creates their own experience in life. And it facilitates the possibility of the agent acting in this way. Not necessarily that the agent has to have a home in order to have a gift or to give something. But I don't want to get too lost in this analogy. I would like to keep it with us as we go forward. But the role of identity and the relationship that identity has to the willful action of an agent cannot be misrepresented, or should not be misrepresented, or misunderstood. Now, I have to imagine here that the material illustration and analogy is only going to get us so far. So let's unlock the individual then. If I go within myself, I go knocking around in my mind and I say to myself, who are you? Where are you in this mental sphere? What causes you, maybe not what causes you, but what, since you have been caused to be, what is your being? There are any number of ways to answer this question, of course. I could provide characteristics of my personality, descriptions on how I process information, how I relate to the world, my past behaviors, my past experiences, my current associations. And at a certain level, I think my mind, as it examines itself, will just be desiring more and more, almost endless quantities of these characteristics, for which I can satisfy the question of who are you and what makes your identity. In a material example, I think there is a way in which, in the example of the house, if we take away elements one at a time, eventually we will come to a point where the house is no longer habitable, but there surely would be situations in which some people would identify a house uninhabitable sooner than others, which would imply
that there are elements of the identity for which some are willing to accept as fundamental, and there are some that are not. There are some that would suggest that just having some sort of covering over the sky in case of rain is sufficient to call that a house or a home. There are many that would say that a home and a house has to have certain things within it. It must be insulated, it must have walls around it, it must have a solid floor, a solid foundation. And there are others that would nitpick this and say, well, it doesn't necessarily have to have insulation. It does have to have a solid foundation. It does have to have 4 walls and a roof that covers us. By and large, there would be some agreement about a certain number of principles, but there would be some variation, surely. Getting lost in the variation is not our goal. Our goal is the establishment of identity. And so if we go off the idea that there is some general consensus, some reasonable way that one can identify something that is. I'm getting quite simplistic here. But there's a reasonable way to identify that which is, some of which at the outset depends on the establishment and the recognition of the various elements. But once the elements are established, then the identity takes precedent, and really the individual elements don't matter so much anymore. It is the general purpose and relationship of the conglomeration of the identity to the rest of the environment. And so the first actual step that I will take is to say that within the agent, and within that agent's responsibility of action, I will say that it is only possible that the agent can do this if there is something else outside of him, outside of the agent. Now, whether it be because of the observer or the way things are, individual elements, fundamental elements, seemingly are unstable to exist alone and by themselves. There must be a relationship among things in order for some thing to exist. And because we have this relationship, because one of the preconditions for having an identity is having some relationship with something outside of that identity, then I think we're getting a little bit closer to understanding exactly what it means to give. Now, surely we're not there yet, because I can't necessarily say exactly what giving is. I could say it quite easily at a certain level, but down here thinking about identity, it's harder for me to say. So the question that I would like to explore is, what does it mean for the agent to give something? To act and to give. Is there a part of the agent that is being transmitted from one identity to another, such that there is a firmly established relationship among the two? Well, we must explore. So let's take an agent. Let's take myself, for example. The material world complicates things a little bit, but let's see how far we can get. If I pick up my phone and I give this to someone. I suppose there are various levels of giving. I can give it to someone in the sense that I expect them to hold it, to keep it safe. I can give it to somebody and not expect to have the phone returned to me. And this type of gift is more of what we were talking about. In both situations, I'm making some decision. I am the agent that is doing something willful. I'm initiating some action. In this space, we are graduated from the thinking about the individual elements that create an identity, but now the various identities that are interacting with each other to form something else. And I think within this act of giving, what we are forming is something higher than the identities themselves, because the identities are now participating in something that is broader. And the whole process of gift giving can be underlined or circled, whatever, and we can analyze this. The components that are involved here, as I've said, involve multiple identities. They don't merge into one identity in the sense that when I give my phone to somebody else, then the other person that I've given my phone to and my phone has now integrated themselves at the level of the individual elements that form my identity. No, I still have my own identity, much like within my identity, the fundamental characteristics and material processes, whatever, material relationships, whatever, they exist independent of the higher level of behavior and action. Let's take a different example. Leave giving aside for the moment. Let's imagine a landscape. The landscape that I'm considering in my mind is sort of a marshy environment. Maybe we can think of it as a pond, but there's not much open water to be spoken of. There's quite a bit of water, but much of it is covered by different objects. Many of these objects are lily pads, these leaves and plants that float on top of the water. Now, interspersed in these lily pads, we have different patches of different types of organisms that have arisen in this environment. We have long grasses, we have bushes, we have various animals that participate in that environment. In the distance, we have the beginning of a forest or of a wooded area. Now, of this picture, of this image, we can say that there is an ecosystem, that there are a bunch of different elements that participate together in order to form what we are seeing in our minds, this image of this landscape, of this marshy landscape. And between some things and other things, there may be a greater degree of dependence. But all of these things together form a bigger identity than one individual lily pad or one individual molecule of water, and on down the line. Now, what if it was to be said that one of these lily pads, if we zoom in on this image in our mind, was to give something to part of this ecosystem? Maybe it has a gift in and of itself. How would we conceptualize of this? Of course, it has its purpose, it has a function. What it gives, I think, is necessarily related to its relationship in the broader identity. Because if it didn't give anything, it would not necessarily be related to the broader identity. But certainly it must give something.
And as I've said, there are degrees of dependence. An ecosystem is a complicated environment. But just considering this one lone lily pad that floats atop the water, it utilizes the water, no doubt. It utilizes the carbon dioxide in the air around it. It serves as a place of refuge for the animals that are beneath it, or a perch for an animal that wishes to be atop that structure. There's a complicated web of materials that it is drawing up from the substrate for which its roots are ingrained. So I've described a few different situations here in which this lily pad takes and also gives. It takes in the sense that it takes nutrients from the environment, and it gives in the sense that it does give nutrients to the environment as a food source, as a habitat and shelter. Again, it provides oxygen. It provides water quality improvement through nutrient uptake, reduces the algal blooms, the algal blooms. It stabilizes the sediment, reducing erosion and turbidity. There's an aspect of temperature regulation, stabilizing the temperature of the water. Again, producing this environment, ecosystem, participating in the broader identity for life, for the aquatic species. For my own part, my own observation, they provide an aesthetic beauty to them. Okay, so we have this analogy to this ecosystem. If I'm going to draw this out and say, let's return back to the ecosystems that the human being can find himself or herself in, that might not be a better word, the various identities that the human being can find himself in. What he wishes to participate in may or may not be explicitly known to him at the time of his giving, but what he gives and what he participates in will influence the broader identities that he is participating in, much like the lily pad contributes to the environment that it participates in. Now, there's an aspect of this verse that we have to discuss that I have not touched on. And it has to do with the way in which a gift is maybe received or given. Whoso boasts himself of a false gift is like clouds and wind without rain. So this boasting of a gift, it would be as if the lily pad were to say, a strange thing to say, but if the lily pad occupied the type of agentic arena that the human being does, it may say, if it was egotistical and boastful, that not only does it provide the things that I have mentioned, but also it is responsible for the existence of all other lily pads. This would be a strange sort of thing, for we know it's not the case that one lily pad exists independently. It is the series of affordances, it is the give and take, that the lily pad is allowed to participate in that environment. And their participation in that environment then bleeds down into the fundamental aspects of their own identity that have been formed along with the rest of the environment. So today is a new day, and it will take me some time to finish off this verse, for I'll have to remember and revisit what I was talking about the day prior. From what I remember, if I'm to give this a summary, a gift is no simple matter. Neither is the reception of said gift. But giving is something that many of us do without even giving much attention. We are beings that are based on reciprocation. Our being involves reciprocation. There are a series of affordances that are necessary in order for us to maintain our experience, our existence. There are various identities that we participate in while maintaining a solid individual identity. But of the giving aspect of man, I think about another example, that of perception. And this perception of the world around us, much of which comes into us through means that are automatic. We don't choose necessarily to feel the world around us, and yet we do, because we are much like a root that has grown into the ground. We are a being that has intelligibility, or that is capable of intuiting its environment and its own self-awareness. We are like roots that grow into this intellectual sphere. We have these physical bodies that allow us to perceive and to synthesize information for our own purposes. And the nestedness of our experience, the basic perception being at one level. At another level, we consider mind, we consider directed action, meaningful and purposeful action, not only to utilize and to act on sensory information from the environment, but also to put forth some behavior or action in the world such that it sets about a different series of inputs. Within the word gift here, I think we are prompted to consider two things: that of the reception and that of the possession of something, the precursor to action. The gift is something that we believe that we possess. We believe that we are in control of this thing that we can put out into the environment. That it may change the environment in some way. It may cause a ripple effect, much like any particular organism that we can identify and examine the niche in the environment under which that organism lives. A gift is a particular trait. We could think of a gift as an affinity towards something. Some people are good at physical pursuits. Other people are good at intellectual pursuits. There are people that are good at particular types of intellectual pursuits, and so on and so on. These sorts of things we can consider to be gifts. Generally speaking, they don't necessarily have to be something that is innate. As I've mentioned about perception, it's just a step up, I think, from that. And what I mean to say is that a person can have an innate gift in a particular field, subject, whatever. But there is also the general capacity that is the gift of life itself, and the gift of the type of beings that we are, at the level of experience that we are, that we can attend, and as I've mentioned just a moment ago, put into action our desire for something that doesn't quite yet exist, an aspect of our environment that, independent of our gift, or giving, I should say, would not otherwise occur. And unlike the lily pad, who certainly at some level has quite a sophisticated relationship to the environment in terms of giving, of affording, and also receiving. Man has an extension of this gift, of the ability to give and the ability to perceive or to receive. Whoso boasteth himself of a false gift. Now, a false gift in this context, and by false, of course, I mean something that is other than true. That is, a person claiming that what they have received is other than it is, or that their ability to act in a particular way or to have a particular effect on an environment is not as they say. It's as if the pieces are there, the intellectual qualities are there, the ideas are there, but the transmission of all of that into some relatable, purposeful experience in the material world has yet to manifest. And perhaps we don't necessarily have to say that it's in the material world. We can just as easily imagine this occurring in the field of mind, in the field of relationships, of complex human relationships. In this analogy, clouds and wind without rain, we have all of the fundamentals. Everything that is a prerequisite for the action of the rain falling to earth is there. And yet it doesn't happen. The expectation is left unsatisfied. The giving aspect has yet to reach the environment. And so it cannot be said that what was hypothesized is now related to the world, because it is not. And this question of relation, I think, is quite interesting, because it's related in some way, because still there are components that are there. But it's, as the analogy of the house, it's as if there is some cardboard structure or some basic structure, a skeleton, without much support, structural support. There would be no reasonable way anybody would live in such a structure. There is not enough to maintain that identity of what we consider to be that gift. By long forbearing is a prince persuaded, and a soft tongue breaks the bone. So we're going to have to begin by talking about this word forbearing, a particularly heavy word, it would seem, in the context of this verse. So forbear. If we look at the word for, the prefix, we have a meaning that means before or in front of. And bear, it comes from a word from Old English meaning to carry or to bear in the context of giving birth to or producing. So we have a reference to some dimension, which is time. And within this dimension, our thought rests. And we say, at some point before what? Before production, before coming into being, before that creative element. So there's a long period that we deliberate before the productive period, before the birth of something. By long forbearing is a prince persuaded. Now, there's nothing really, so this is the beauty, I think, of the Proverbs. There's nothing really that says to us what is being deliberated in the period of forbearing. It is just saying that the time before the creative element, the genesis, the birth, is long. And so there is this implication that something is occurring here from on the part of the prince, or on the part of the prince and his aides and his fellow deliberators, interlocutors, whatever. And there is this process by which somebody that is in a lofty position of authority, attends to some subject. And we are prompted to consider, well, why should that be the case? And the answer is clear to many, surely. But it is clear in the sense that we understand by experience what this means. That for matters that are important to us, we tend to take time and to examine the elements. The question is, well, there are two questions. One is that all we are doing, that we are examining the elements of a dilemma or a problem? And then two is, well, what is the fruit of the examination of these elements? What does it provide us? In the first instance, the question of, well, is it the case that in cases of long forbearing, that we are analyzing just the elements of a particular problem? I suppose the answer could be any number of things. The word only is quite restrictive. I think in the sense of a prudent counsel, the individual elements will surely be analyzed. For the individual elements are the things that give one a coherent understanding of an identity. We are looking at the qualities of that identity. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is some difficulty in trying to completely know an identity, to completely make it individual, separate from everything else. That it is not possible. There's a degree to which we do it, such that we can identify it for its own identity, but it cannot exist independent of anything else. It is not an intelligibility that exists on its own. Ownness, I think, is another interesting thing to talk about. Ownness and oneness is interesting, but for the time being, it'll suffice to say that an identity is reliant on other identities for its existence, its being. In the human context, we are much like a developer in terms of the old way of developing photographs. That it takes time for us to be soaked and worn into the surface in order for an image or a projection of what actually is to form within our minds. Certain situations are much faster than others, obviously. Basic processing, maybe I say basic, but in terms of relative to large dynamic problems that we may face, simple dynamic processing, like my ability to see what's in front of me right now and to maintain my seated position in this chair without falling off, it depends on many things, but the processing of this information is very quick. This type of relatedness to the environment is very strong. But in novel situations, in situations where there is a complex problem, today, for example, there was an attempted assassination on former President Donald Trump. And when I watched the video, it's interesting to hear the recording of his security staff yelling to one another that they should get up and move. And then, I don't know how long it was later, maybe 10 seconds later, then actually something started to happen. And there was this sense of incoherence that, much like the last verse, there was a false gift that had, or a false sense of giving that had occurred. The components were there. The clouds and the wind were there. The men to support Donald Trump were ready to lift him and carry him. But they did not do it. They did not act on that desire, that collective desire. And there was this, and I don't want to look into this too much because I want to say that, well, there's this long forbearing that occurred in order for them to assess the situation and then move him. I think this is probably correct. But what I wanted to say more so in this context, in this situation, is what will happen now. The analysis of the situation now going into this presidential election. Things have changed. How exactly have they changed? Well, it'll take time for us to know how this event has changed public opinion, what it necessarily means for our country and our collective identity. Surely there will be some that don't place much value in it, and there will be others that place a lot of value in it, and there will be others that will be in between, that will be on the fence. But surely most of us will be aware that this occurred. It will have entered into our minds in some way. And for those who are in positions of authority that need to make strong decisions, there will be this period of long forbearing. And the reason is because the information that is out there, one, is not immediately available. So there will be time that is required to spend to sift through the information, to find it and to make it known to us. This could be in the context of the situation surrounding the event. Who was the shooter? Why did he do it? Was he involved with some greater identity, a larger spirit? I think of the situations that we have had in our history, the assassination of Kennedy, for example, by agents of our own intelligence institutions. So today is a new day. Today, thankfully, is a day that I have had some rest. It is a Sunday, and so I was allowed to sleep in, thank God. And it's amazing what sleep will do to the mind, how it changes its perspective, how it refreshes its perspective. And it has me feeling, although it's at the end of the day today on Sunday, it has me feeling in a particular way. Particular thoughts are coming to mind. And I would like to say some of this just to introduce the second half of the verse. Of course, this is my time, my selfish time, to go within myself. It is almost a prayer in a way. I just finished a dinner with friends. I saw my friend's little daughter, whom I am fond of, less than a year old. And I enjoy and I cherish the interactions that I have with her. It's interesting building a relationship with a small child or an animal. It's interesting to me, in my experience, how I am never too far from longing or from a type of melancholy. And every once in a while you hear this and that sort of thing about what depression is and what causes it and how it may be hereditary and all of this sort of thing, how it can be caused from trauma. And I don't say that necessarily to say that I am a particularly depressed person, but I am somebody that is predisposed to it, I think. It returns to me every once in a while. The melancholy comes to me. And given that I am of a certain age, I understand that this is a part of my life. It's not something that will go away. And of late, I've been using it in rather productive means when it comes. It's quite interesting fuel for productive thought. It's not necessarily, of course, I am committed to a particular type of disposition, that I am faithful, and that I do wish to have the good. But when the feelings come that seem almost independent of my faith, I take them and I look at them and I examine them. I ask them questions. Sometimes they get the better of me. But in my stronger moments, when I am able to sit tall and to bear the onslaught, the anxieties, the longing, the darkness, the pull towards something that frightens me, then I see, given enough pushing, that this desire and this longing is satisfied by goodness, if I give it a chance to be. But it requires a lot of patience. A lot of patience. A soft tongue breaks the bone. A weird expression. So let's begin with the soft tongue. A physical illustration comes to mind. Soft and tongue don't necessarily seem to go together. For if I was to feel my tongue, I'm not really sure if I would describe it as soft. I'd be more inclined to provide an adjective that would have to do with wetness than anything. But of course, in this domain, we are not strictly talking about a material equivalency here. In terms of the tongue, I think what we are considering is an analogy or a metaphor for something that is greater. That the tongue and its purpose is the manipulation of sounds such that we can form language, we can form words and put them together in sentences. So if we keep in our mind this purpose of this organ, the tongue, the question becomes, once we begin to add different adjectives to describe the tongue and the way that it might behave, how would that influence its purpose? How would that road towards some end be taken? Now, of the word soft, I think there are many things that we can say about it. What immediately comes to mind are two things. Soft in terms of weakness, a poor sense of attention, inability to follow through on important decisions, easily distracted. This is what I think of when I think of the word soft, as it is informally considered on top of that word weakness. I also think of a material fabric that is soft. In fact, I have a blanket on my bed that's extremely soft. Not really sure what it's made out of, but that's what comes to mind at least. Now, just as with the tongue, we are not necessarily concerned with the material causes. We're not necessarily concerned with the material objects. Much like the tongue, I had defined it based on its purpose, given the context here. Now, the purpose of something that is soft is a bit more difficult to describe. For something soft can be comforting in the case of a blanket. It is something that feels good against the skin. It feels good to our perception. It is something that we would wish to have more of. It is something that we wouldn't necessarily want in every situation. I wouldn't want to be wrapped in a blanket when I am tasked with solving a difficult problem or responsible for acting quickly. For example, if I'm driving on the highway and somebody swerves into my lane without seeing me, at that time being covered in a soft blanket seems like the last thing that I would wish for myself. And moreover, the perception of the softness and the comfort therein, I think, again, would be the last thing that I would be thinking of. And so although I don't necessarily think that in totality my explanation of the extension of soft as weakness applies here, I do think that the aspect that can be related to weakness in a way and also related to strength in a way is this type of comfort. The softness that we gravitate towards when we are just about to lay our heads to rest. It is something that we earn in a certain sense. That we have spent our energies throughout the day doing particular things, hopefully productive things, such that in the end, the comfort and the relief seems necessary, and also right. It is a just thing to accept. Another way, I think, in which one can determine or to interpret the word soft would be in the context of the expression of somebody being soft-spoken. If they are soft-spoken, then it could be a physical sense, in the sense that the volume of speech is relatively low. Somebody could be soft-spoken in the sense that they do not say much, and that it's more about the restraint that one gives their tongue, that gives their manipulation of language, that they pay attention to what they say, and they only sparingly speak. They are soft-spoken. Perhaps they do so because they wish people to pay attention, and they wait to speak under conditions in which they understand that they will be heard. Now, I particularly find this a beautiful type of interaction. I myself, throughout my life, have experienced these sorts of things. I have found it very difficult to grab people's attention if I'm not in some professional context where I sort of have to do it, if I'm forcing myself into this relationship. But if I wish something to unfold naturally, I can establish my environment the way in which I like, and then sit down and ease my way into a conversation. In that way, I feel not necessarily like a snake, but I feel cool. I feel as it should be. I feel that I'm deliberating. I feel like that I'm giving the relationship and the conversation the respect that it deserves. But enough about me and my opinions and my feelings about that. So before us now, we have a few different ways in which we can think of this word soft. Now, putting them together, taking the informational machine that is the mind, and that is the the part of the factory that is responsible for putting the big components together, the big meaningful pieces together, to convey meaning, to articulate speech, putting words subtly together, and not just together to get broad meanings apart, but putting meaning together precisely. We think of the tongue. We expand this, and then we think of adding a hint of softness to it. That it is soft in the sense that it is strategic. It is patient. It waits when it has sufficient leverage. In this situation, I think of a mix between the material imagery and more of the symbolic imagery, but in terms of the physical imagery, what I'm imagining in my mind is the way in which the soft speech may not necessarily be forceful in every situation, but again, given enough leverage, given that distance from the axis is sufficiently long, it doesn't take much for that subtlety of speech to press down a little bit and then causes that break in the continuity of the physical structure, the supporting structure of whatever it happens to be that we are considering, whether it be an argument, it could be a relationship, it could be anything really. Now, when I mentioned the physical structure, of course, I was thinking about the word, the bone, but also I was thinking about, just as I thought about the tongue, well, what does the bone represent in the body? It is the supporting structure. It is the foundation that supports our musculature. It provides axes for rotation so that we can move and all of this sort of thing. Without a foundation, whether it be the bones or it be in a house, it severely restricts our purpose or the purpose of a particular thing. And if we were to, just for example's sake, if we were to rob somebody of the capacity to think and to put sentences together, rob them of their language, their purpose, while although may not necessarily be changed, it is certainly affected by that, by the result of that change. Now, thinking about this in the broader context, by long forbearing is a prince persuaded, and a soft tongue breaketh the bone. The image that I have in my mind is that since we are talking about a prince, we're talking about a particular principality that's carved out within this mental sphere. I think there's a lot that can be said about the prince, and perhaps it's wrong of me not to go into that in more detail, but just thinking about the prince as a person in position of authority that has a lot of potential to rise up to the next position of authority, like if the king were to step down or if the king were to be killed or what have you. The prince still, within the nobility class, has certain responsibilities that we don't have, we being common people. So if we imagine this process of forbearing, this extended process of waiting before the birth of something up until the point of frustration, perhaps. Maybe frustration it's not necessary, but the point that actual work has to occur, much like, at least I think, that once my mind gets going on a particular proverb and I feel around the environment, I forbear, I sort of forestall the conclusion because I want to explore the environment before that type of process or effort is put forth, such that I am more certain that the conclusions that I am coming to is based on sound reason, that there is relatedness among the different elements that I am exploring, that there is logical coherence. And this is all imagined within the context of this principality of the prince, extended above much of our responsibilities that many of us can imagine. Then I think what we are prompted to consider is the gravity of the process that is occurring, and of course the process itself. And despite the position, despite all of the weight and gravity behind an individual's decision, despite all the possibilities for a man to lose themselves in their own selfish conception of their place in the world and their outsourced or outsized perception of their own capacities and, again, responsibilities, we are left humbled by the soft tongue that breaks the foundational structure. What comes to us, and what may come to us in periods of long forbearing, is a foundational shift, for which something subtle, but something only subtle through the distance afforded to us by time. When I say the distance that is afforded to us by time, what I mean to say is there's an image of some axis. The distance is there, the time is the force that comes down on that particular lever that causes that transmission to rotate around that axis, to then come to the attention of some principle that was otherwise unknown to us before the process of forbearing had occurred. Have you found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for you, lest you be filled therewith and vomit it. So this symbol of honey, something that is sweet, it is something that is found in nature. It is something of a dangerous substance, surrounded by bees, for which our procurement of the substance may cause us harm. It is something that is desirable. It is something that doesn't take extra steps to process. It is something that just sort of, as I've mentioned, is natural. Of course, it's processed by some organism, but in terms of the human context, it's readily available to us. Eat so much as is sufficient for you. Lest you be filled therewith and vomit. So it's the classic example of too much of a good thing can actually be a bad thing. And what we are prompted to consider here is then the context of the situation, because obviously the statement too much of a good thing doesn't really make sense. Too much of a good thing being a bad thing doesn't make sense. Too much goodness is just a lot of goodness. It's not too much goodness and then it becomes bad and wicked and evil. There's a point at which the goodness becomes bad. And what we are asked to consider then is a particular example in our lives where we know something to be good. We've experienced it. We have tasted it. We have reflected on it. We return to it because it provides us with comfort. It provides us with solace. And yet anything, it would seem, in excess, or the particular thing in question, would cause us to have the opposite reaction. Now, I could say that there is something about what I'm doing here that is good. There's something about my reflective pursuit that provides me with some good in my life. It is something that I can integrate, I can take with me, I can use it in my everyday experiences. I can use it at work. I can use it with friends. I can use it with family. But I can sit here for some variable amount of time. And certainly I think I can imagine a place, there certainly have been days, in which I feel that my reflective capacity and my drive have not been to the standard that I know that they should be. And because they fall short of that standard, I am left with being within the domain of counterproduction. Now there's nuance to this particular example, and I think I should give another one because this is a complicated one. Now I'm taking something that is very good, that I view as very good. One of the best processes, best practices that I have incorporated into my life is this. It is reflection. It is reading the book and thinking. And to imagine the case where it would be there, that it would go bad, I think is necessary to understand what specifically about this practice is good. Now I may or may not bring another example into this, but just so that I am prepared, this is going to take some time to uncover. For the first question is, what am I doing right now? Well, I'm reading something. I'm taking in information. I'm processing that information. I'm verbalizing as a part of my processing. The question then is, well, if you consider this reflection and this processing to be a good thing, then does it matter the type of information that you receive and that you process? And I think the answer is yes. And the question is why? Well, the answer is there can be this process, the reflective process, I think can do a lot of good with very little. And that's not to put down the verses in the Proverbs. But it is to say that it is a good practice, and that if I took something that was lighter in meaning, let's say like a contemporary pop song, and I thought about some of the deeper fundamentals about the relatedness among the words and exactly what the main theme of the song actually means downstream, and what we can say of it from a ethical domain, what conclusions we can come to, it would be quite interesting. Much like the strong force at the center of an atom, there is something that is within the depths of our capacity to reason about something, that we can unleash this tremendous amount of creative energy if we dig deep enough. I suppose there are limits to our deduction, but that's not really the point of what I mean to say here. What I mean to say is, again, there are plenty of things that I can think about and reflect on that would prove productive. But there are also things that I could think about and reflect on that would prove contrary. That there is an aspect of faith, the desire towards goodness, that is a prerequisite in order to reflect on something and move towards those good ends. Now, of the condition in which this would not be a productive pursuit, I think although there may be plenty of hidden gems within the simplicity of things, if I were to take an ad, now I see a a letter that's in front of me that contains an ad about a particular publisher, I could find myself into strange creative territory, no doubt. Just reading a few words, a few letters. I can think of Platonic dialogues that have discussed the meaning of things by the relatedness of the letters and trying to find exactly where the meaning is, and it's fascinating. And that sort of conversation can be got to through some superficial means. However, if the goal is to focus on the content of what's on the page, of what's on the advertisement, then the focus would itself be quite superficial. The landscape that would be in front of me would be dull. It would be much like a typical American strip mall. It's a bit overgrown with weeds. There's a few stores. Every other store is punched out, and it has the lining around where the letters of the store name used to be, then again followed by some strange business that one has to wonder how many people actually go to. This is the type of environment that I imagine that the reflective sphere would involve or bring us to in that situation. Again, there can be beauty in it if one chooses to find it. There's truth and beauty everywhere. But for practical purposes, I would not want to spend my days there in and out, when I know that there are better things, better sources to go to, that there's a lot of beauty to be had in the Bible, which is why I go there. Now, it can also be said, now this is an older conversation that I used to have a lot earlier on in the Proverbs, about how in the center of every city, in the center of every heart, at the center perhaps of every reason for something, every conclusion, there is this aspect of unfortunate decay. There's an aspect of the strange, of the foreign. I want to say wicked, but it's not necessarily wicked. It is just otherness. It is opposition. It is contrariness that exists there. Much like a situation that we can imagine about this unfortunate run-down strip mall, American strip mall, we can imagine a beautiful landscape that has perhaps an unfortunate dead animal in the middle of the field or something that's producing this putrid smell and an unfortunate sight. There will always be something that we find distasteful, even within the most beautiful of imaginings. And so it would seem that we're faced with a dilemma. My mind wishes that once it finds something that is beautiful, that it can hold on to it, that it will be something that I can just sort of harmoniously fall into, and my existence will just be as I know that beauty can be. Let's take, for example, exercise. Exercise is something that I have found incredible beauty in, but I have been guilty of asking or wanting more out of it than it is able to give me, or that I am able to give it. I think there's a two-way street there. There's a relationship, there's a bondedness. What comes to mind here is context. Con in the sense of this with or together, and then the textual binding. But of course it's not necessarily in this situation a literary text. It is an experiential thing, experiential pursuit, whatever. And in terms of the honey that I had found, the beauty that I had found, it was something about in the suffering and the striving and within the result that the suffering and the striving brought. And of course, it wasn't just completely suffering and striving, that there was plenty of goodness to be found within it, but there's plenty of markers and thresholds in the return to the testing and the difficulty that would feel anything other than pure and good. It feels as though what is being drawn from you is just black tar. It is the plaque that surrounds the arteries. It is everything that is evil within us is being drawn from us, both from a physical standpoint, but also from a mental, psychological testing standpoint. And once I've been through many ups and downs with exercise, I've been in very good shape and in quite poor shape. And what I've found within those ups and downs is that when I have been in the poor shape, I haven't lost my love for this exercise, but my relationship to it has changed. The weak person desires that goodness without understanding that even within that goodness, they will find something that they find distasteful. And that there's this certain fallacy about utopian participation that exists within my mind and perhaps the minds of many that I interact with, that unfortunately leads to the pattern of this verse. Have you found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for you, lest you be filled therewith and vomit. Now, there are plenty of examples I think that I can go into that illustrates this. There are plenty examples that everybody has that they have experienced. And I wonder if there's not something a little bit deeper here that I should explore. I believe that there is. So far where I am, this idea of taking something that is good, taking something that is sweet, and then having too much of it such that at a certain point the relationship becomes contrary. The item itself no longer satisfies the desire or the purpose. And now what we are left with is the unfortunate feeling of sickness. Or the inability to participate with something. I think that's another way of seeing this. That if we desire something, it could be a relationship, it could be occupational. If we desire a particular type of participation, that participation is sweet like our honey, something that we know would sustain us because it's just good, it feels good. But then there is that realization, there is that threshold that must be met, that must be sacrificed in order for the context or for the proper relationship to be in place such that we are allowed to experience that goodness. Now, I won't go as far to say that suffering is the fundamental quality of this, that without suffering, that all honey would just be a nauseating experience, without difficulty. Because there is a way in which one can find themselves saying, well, without evil, without the tendency towards nothingness, then there would be no goodness. Now, I'm not sure if that's the case. But for our part, I think regardless of whether or not we see it as suffering, the true participation with goodness will require a period for which we don't necessarily see or understand that goodness. I think there's a way in which goodness can be self-refreshing, that what we may be desiring and what we may choose to participate in is sweet like honey, but then the goodness changes into some new domain. Instead of that sweet honey, it becomes a salty steak or something, some completely different domain of goodness. It's hard to say exactly. For goodness must be such a broad subject and topic and experience. Have you found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient. Now, this idea of sufficiency is the other thing that I would like to speak on. For what does it mean to be sufficient? To have enough of something. Something that is adequate. How do I know, for example, that what I have done here is enough and sufficient, it is adequate, such that tomorrow I will be able to take some aspect of wisdom with me in my working day and expand my relatedness to other people, to expand my productive capacity, for surely it is the result of some reflection that one comes to a greater degree of understanding. The last verse is something that we had just explored this. It is that extended period before what comes to be. That extended period that we are considering of that what shall come to be. And then given all of the work, all of the preparation, it doesn't take much once we are in position. But once we are in position, then a soft tongue is sufficient to disrupt those foundations or to reestablish foundations. And so while this process may occur, while it is evident that I myself am an individual, what causes the various qualities and elements of my being to be sufficient enough for an identity to occur? Now let's take a rather disgusting example. In front of me I have a toenail that I had peeled off of my toe as I was reflecting on things. The identity of this toenail, barring that it is separate now from the larger whole of that toenail, this clipping has an identity in and of itself. It is a material thing composed of many different atoms and organization of the atoms, not to mention that the nail is not the only thing that is here. There's certainly bacteria, perhaps there's some dirt from the environment, whatever. but it is an identity. It is something that has some existence. It can be seen by an observer such as myself through its various qualities, and through my ability to perceive it through the organs of perception that I possess. Tactile, visual, olfactory, I suppose I could use. But what makes it sufficient? Now this reminds me of the lily pad analogy, that what makes it sufficient is not its own independent identity, but its relationship to the other identities around it. And this brings up another point that I had difficulty with earlier, about identifying the goodness, and the question being, well, is it the absence of goodness that allows goodness to be, or is it a necessary condition for the identity of goodness to be, assuming that there is something outside of that goodness? It's difficult for me to say, for I am asked to consider a divine logos, after all, a center point for all intelligibility, the underlying substrate that was created by some singular source, the source under which all forms of relatedness participate, because they all build back up into that thing, regardless of how minuscule the identity happens to seem to us to be. What is sufficient for this nail to have an identity of its own? In the first instance, I have it on my desk. I suppose we can think of color. Color is quite superficial, for it could still be of the same color and be of a different identity. The only issue would be that the observer, being myself, would have a difficult time differentiating the nail from the countertop or the table. So that would not necessarily be sufficient to identify, or to, rather, it would not be sufficient to say that the thing that makes this nail a separate identity from the table is its color. There's something more fundamental. And I think I can keep going in this manner until I caused this nail to be of such a similar constitution to the table that there would be no difference. And at which point, the qualities that make up the identity are no longer sufficient to maintain some independence from the larger table that it rests upon. And so the answer, I think, to the question of sufficiency is that it must have a quality that is just enough to differentiate it from something else that it is related to. And what comes to mind here, again, is this concept of nothingness versus somethingness. That somethingness's relatedness to nothing is the sufficient cause for it to be. This is something that I think I'll have to come back to. I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time, chapter 25 of the Proverbs.